The shocking dark history of Rothschilds, Waddesdon Manor, Old Money exposed, Buckinghamshire, England. 1874. A bare hilltop sits empty, windswept, unremarkable. Local farmers pass it daily without a second glance. The soil is poor, the slope is steep. No one in their right mind would choose this place to build anything significant. Then a stranger arrives, Ferdinand de Rothschild, a quiet, sickly man with money that seems to have no bottom. He buys the hill, he buys the land around it. Nearly 3,000 acres. And then he makes an announcement that stuns everyone who hears it. He is going to build a palace, not an English manor, not a modest country house. A French Renaissance château, here, on this impossible hill, in the middle of nowhere. The locals think he has lost his mind. They have no idea what is really happening. They cannot see that this hill, this palace, this entire elaborate construction is not about beauty or comfort or taste. It is about survival. It is about a family that has been hunted across Europe for being Jewish. A family that has been caricatured, legislated against, excluded, and attacked. A family that believes if they can just build something perfect enough, grand enough, English enough, they might finally be safe. They are wrong. And today we dive into the shocking dark history of Rothschild's Waddesdon Manor, the secrets hidden in the basement, the servants who knew more than ministers, the wartime function no one talks about. Nazi theft, the desperate performance of belonging that never quite worked, and the question that haunts every gilded room: what do you do when you realize that no amount of money can ever make you truly safe? If you want to explore the real stories behind history's greatest houses, the ones they don't tell on the official tour, hit that like button, subscribe, and drop a comment telling me which mansion I should investigate next. Your support makes these deep dives possible. Now let's go back. Back before the chandeliers, before the parties, before the palace. Back to the boy who would spend his entire life trying to prove he deserved to exist. Paris, 1839. Ferdinand James Anselm de Rothschild enters the world fragile, pale, struggling to breathe. The doctors gather. Private physicians, the best money can buy. They whisper in corners. The prognosis is never spoken aloud in front of the family, but everyone understands it. This child may not survive. His father, Anselm, runs the Rothschild Bank in Frankfurt and Vienna. One uncle controls Paris. Another dominates London. A third operates in Naples. The family business is a web that stretches across Europe, moving gold, government bonds, information faster than any competitor can match. Ferdinand's brothers are being groomed for this empire. Strong boys, confident, quick with numbers. Expected to sit through marathon dinners with ministers and remember which railway connects to which cousin, which government owes what, which revolution might threaten which investment. Ferdinand is kept apart, protected, the weak one. Childhood illness teaches you things that healthy children never learn. It teaches you that your worth feels conditional, that you are always one fever away from being written off, that you must prove yourself in ways your strong brothers will never have to imagine. And it teaches you something else, something darker and more useful. When the real world feels dangerous, when your body betrays you, when your place in the family machinery feels uncertain, you start building inner worlds you can control. Ferdinand is sent to England as a teenager. The explanation is health-related. English air, English climate, supposedly gentler on weak lungs than harsh continental winters. It is an odd prescription, given England's famous damp and fog. But families in fear will believe anything that offers hope. He arrives shy, foreign, his English uncertain. His role in the great Rothschild machine undefined. He is not being trained to run banks. He is not sitting in on the meetings where empires are financed and wars are funded. He is the spare, the afterthought, the one they hope survives but do not quite count on. And then he falls in love. Her name is Evelina, his cousin. Rothschild marriages often stayed within the family. It kept the banking network tight, kept inheritances concentrated, kept secrets inside the clan where they could be controlled. Evelina is 18. Ferdinand is 26 when they marry in 1865. The letters that survive between them suggest this was more than a calculated dynastic alliance. There are jokes, shared anxieties, plans for a life together, real affection, maybe even love. She dies 18 months later. Childbirth, the baby dies too. Here the historical record falls almost silent. Victorian men, especially Rothschild men who are expected to steady empires and entertain royalty without visible emotion, do not write easily about grief. There are no dramatic diary entries, no confessional letters to friends, just a gap in the correspondence, a withdrawal from certain activities, a quietness that those who knew him later would describe as permanent. But Ferdinand's choices after Evelina's death speak louder than any diary ever could. He steps away from the family bank, not completely. You do not simply leave the Rothschild network, but he loosens his grip. He lets his brothers take the lead in Vienna and Frankfurt. He stays in England, and he begins to collect, obsessively, porcelain, paintings, furniture, manuscripts, snuff boxes, clocks, textiles, objects he can catalog and control and arrange into precise order. Objects that will never leave him. Objects that cannot die in childbirth. By his early 30s, Ferdinand has assembled a collection that rivals public institutions. His London house is overflowing. Rooms turn into storage. Staircases narrow as crates pile up. Every spare surface becomes a display. He is drowning in beauty, surrounding himself with things that whisper permanence even as his own life has taught him how fragile everything actually is. But collections like this demand more than walls. They demand a stage. They demand a setting that tells visitors how important these objects are, how refined the man who owns them must be, how much he belongs among the people whose ancestors once owned these very pieces before selling them off to pay debts. They demand a castle. The decision to build Waddesdon emerges in the early 1870s. Ferdinand will later write polite things about wanting a seat in the country worthy of the name. But beneath the careful phrasing, the psychology is transparent. He is designing a monument to control, a place where he can nail beauty into permanence, a house that will force the English aristocracy, who still see the Rothschilds as foreign upstarts, Jewish, continental, too rich too quickly, to acknowledge that this banking family understands elegance as deeply as any duke. He is building a fortress against loss, against rejection, against the knowledge burned into him by illness and bereavement and family history that safety is never guaranteed. Not for a Rothschild, not for a Jew in 19th century Europe, not for anyone, really, but especially not for them. The hill in Buckinghamshire is waiting, and Ferdinand, the boy who was not supposed to survive childhood, is about to try something impossible. He's going to build a palace so perfect, so flawless, so undeniably magnificent that it will prove once and for all that he deserves to be here. The tragedy is that he already knows, somewhere deep in his bones, that it will never be enough. But he will try anyway. Because what else can you do when the alternative is admitting that no amount of money, no amount of taste, no amount of effort will ever fully protect you from a world that has already decided you do not quite belong? You build, you keep building, and you hope that this time, maybe this time, the walls will hold. The hill is a nightmare. Anyone with sense would have walked away. Ferdinand purchases the land near Waddesdon village in 1874. Roughly 2,700 acres of Buckinghamshire countryside. Rolling fields, ancient hedgerows, and at the center that bare, windswept hilltop that makes every surveyor and architect who sees it shake their head. Building on a hill means fighting gravity with every brick. It means creating roads where none exist. It means hauling thousands of tons of material upward, slowly, expensively, dangerously. The nearest railway station sits miles away. The village of Waddesdon is tiny, unprepared for what is about to descend. When Ferdinand's agents start hiring laborers and placing enormous orders for stone, timber, slate, iron, glass, the scale of the plan becomes impossible to hide. This is not a country house. This is a military campaign disguised as architecture. Ferdinand hires a French architect, Gabriel Hippolyte de Stelur, precisely because he wants something that looks nothing like England. No Georgian symmetry, no Palladian calm. He wants a Loire Valley château. The kind of structure French nobles built in the 16th century when they needed to prove something to their king. The irony is obvious to everyone. A Jewish banker hiring a French architect to build a French palace in England to impress the English aristocracy. But Ferdinand understands symbols better than most people realize. If you cannot be born into old European elegance, you can at least buy its blueprints and reassemble them stone by stone on foreign soil. The work begins in earnest in 1877. First comes the hill itself. The bare summit has to be reshaped, leveled, prepared for foundations that can carry weight the land has never borne. Steam engines are hauled up to power excavation. Workers dig down to bedrock in places. Massive retaining walls go up to hold the altered terrain in place. Then the road. Ferdinand commissions a winding drive that climbs the hill in curves, revealing the house in stages as carriages ascend. This is not just practical engineering. It is theater. You are meant to feel anticipation rise with every turn. Later visitors will describe the journey as breathtaking, which is exactly what Ferdinand intended. Slowly, the house emerges from blueprints into reality. Pale Bath stone, Welsh slate, ornamental carvings entrusted to French craftsmen, a central tower. Wings stretching east and west. Dozens of tall windows designed to flood interiors with light in a way most English country houses never attempted. But there is one part of Waddesdon the guests will almost never see. The part that makes everything else possible. The basement. Beneath the gilded reception rooms and portrait galleries lies a hidden maze. Servant corridors, service spaces, kitchens, sculleries, storage vaults, wine cellars. An entire underground infrastructure built to keep the great house functioning while remaining effectively invisible. The servants' wing is physically and socially separated from the world upstairs. Staff enter through different doors, use different staircases, move along carefully planned routes that ensure they will not cross paths with family or guests unless summoned. None of this is unusual for the era. Every great house draws a hard line between above and below. But the scale at Waddesdon pushes the system to an extreme. Ferdinand employs dozens of staff. Once the estate is fully operational, the number rises to well over 100. Footmen, maids, cooks, grooms, gardeners, each person has a defined role. And each understands that the effortless magic upstairs, the perfectly timed courses, the blazing fires, the spotless rooms, depends entirely on them staying out of sight. The house is designed to broadcast taste and refinement. Yet beneath that display, it functions like a precision factory. Every dinner party requires hours of planning. Every weekend gathering demands logistics that border on military precision. The servants know it. The family knows it. The guests pretend not to. This is the bargain of old money architecture. You build something beautiful enough to argue that you belong. And you build it on the labor of people who will never be allowed to belong in the rooms they maintain. By 1883, the main structure is complete. Ferdinand moves in before the interiors are entirely finished. He cannot wait any longer. The French palace on the English hilltop is no longer a vision on paper. It is stone and glass and slate, visible for miles, dominating the landscape exactly as Ferdinand imagined. The locals stop calling him mad. They start calling him barren. But the performance is only beginning. A house is just a shell without the people who animate it. And Ferdinand is about to invite the most powerful figures in England to see with their own eyes what a Rothschild can build when given enough time, enough money, and enough desperation to prove he belongs. The question humming beneath every stone, will it be enough? Will this finally be enough? The honest answer, the one Ferdinand can never quite escape, is always the same. Not yet. Not entirely. So keep building, keep refining, keep performing. And hope that one day, maybe, the performance becomes real. The house is ready. Now it has to work. Ferdinand understands that Waddesdon is not simply a residence. It is a stage. And the production he is mounting needs the right audience, not just wealthy acquaintances, not just fellow bankers or distant cousins. He needs people whose presence will confirm everything the house was built to say. He needs royalty. The Prince of Wales, Albert Edward, the future King Edward VII, first visits Waddesdon in the 1880s. The exact date blurs in various historical accounts, but the meaning is crystal clear. The heir to the British throne is sleeping under a Rothschild roof, eating at a Rothschild table, smoking Rothschild cigars in a smoking room designed with moments exactly like this in mind. This looks like acceptance, or at least the costume of it. The weekend house parties at Waddesdon quickly become famous. Invitations are hunted, compared, bragged about in London drawing rooms. Guests arrive in private railway carriages at the local station, then transfer into Ferdinand's own vehicles for the final ascent. The climb up the winding drive is choreographed to build tension. Trees open to frame glimpses of stone and towers. The château reveals itself piece by piece, swelling with every turn until it dominates the horizon. By the time carriages pull up at the main entrance, guests are already impressed. That is the point. Ferdinand has studied how power works. It is not just what you own. It is how you make people feel when they experience what you own. Inside, every detail has been engineered for effect. Electric lighting, still a novelty in many English homes, pours warm brilliance over the reception rooms. An advanced heating system keeps the building comfortable even in deep winter. Hot water waits in guest bedrooms. A luxury some older aristocratic houses still do not manage consistently. Ferdinand has studied what the British elite prizes, and then he has met it with something just a little more polished, a little more modern, a little more impressive. The weekend rhythm settles into a pattern. Friday arrivals and polite introductions, Saturday shooting parties across the estate. Ferdinand has ensured the grounds are well stocked with game birds for exactly this purpose. Afternoon tea in the drawing rooms. Dinners that stretch to 12 courses, each dish served with quiet precision. Afterward, the traditional separation. Men drifting to the smoking room, women to the drawing room, before the groups come together again for cards, music, or conversation that runs late into the night. But the important work rarely happens at the dining table. It takes shape in corners, in low-voiced exchanges between courses. In the library after midnight when most guests have gone upstairs and a small circle of men remains, brandy glasses in hand, murmuring about government loans, colonial railways, concessions in countries most people could not point to on a map. Ferdinand does not officially turn these weekends into banking conferences. He has stepped back from daily financial operations, yet he is still a Rothschild. His brothers and cousins still run the family houses in London, Paris, Vienna, Frankfurt. When ministers need funds for national projects, when investors want reliable information about foreign markets, when delicate deals require confidentiality, those needs do not vanish at the front door of Waddesdon. They simply move into more discreet spaces. Introductions can be arranged, names exchanged, trust built slowly over cigars, carefully planned menus, and the unspoken understanding that any man capable of creating Waddesdon is plugged into serious capital. The British aristocracy comes. They praise the food. They admire the art. They marvel at the electric lights and the heating and the flawless service. Then they go home and make jokes. The satirical magazine Punch publishes ruthless cartoons. Rothschild figures appear with exaggerated features, hooked noses, clinging to sacks of money, surrounded by symbols of greed. The caricatures blend envy with ridicule. Yes, the Rothschilds possess astonishing wealth, but they are still treated as outsiders, foreign, Jewish. Too rich, too fast. No matter how flawless the French château, no matter how glittering the guest list, they are still in the eyes of many not truly English. Ferdinand sees the cartoons, hears the drawing room quips about Jewish millionaires trying to purchase their way into the landed class. He keeps his reactions private. What could he say publicly that would not deepen the sting? Protesting would only prove the barbs had hit home. So he responds in the only way he believes might work. He escalates. More art, more guests, more precision. If the house is whispered about as too extravagant, he makes it more dazzling. If his hospitality is dismissed as excessive, he makes it meticulous. The counter to exclusion is to become so successful, so indispensable to the social fabric that ignoring him becomes ridiculous. And in many ways, the strategy works. The Prince of Wales keeps returning. Other royals follow, cabinet members, diplomats, foreign dignitaries. Waddesdon shifts from curiosity to fixture, an expected stop on the circuit for anyone who matters in that world. Yet late at night, when the last carriage lamps have vanished down the drive and the servants have cleared the final glasses, Ferdinand sometimes walks the house alone, past portraits he has rescued and purchased, through rooms furnished with pieces that once belonged to French royalty, standing inside a chateau that cost a fortune and took 15 years to bring from idea to reality. The performance is impeccable, the audience applauds, the social calendar confirms his success. But one question lingers beneath the applause. Is he safe yet? Has this finally been enough? The honest answer, the one he can never quite shake, is always the same. Not yet, not entirely, so the weekends continue. The trains keep arriving, the rooms stay full, and Ferdinand keeps proving again and again that he belongs in a world still deciding whether it will ever fully let him in. The parties glitter. The chandeliers blaze, and beneath it all, invisible to the guests sipping champagne in the drawing room, another world operates in shadow. The world of the people who make all of this possible, the servants. A day at Waddesdon begins long before the family wakes, 4:30 in the morning, 5 at the latest. The house has to be fully awake and functioning before anyone upstairs opens their eyes. Kitchen maids light the coal ranges, massive iron beasts that heat the ovens and water for an entire day's cooking. Scullery maids haul buckets. Despite Waddesdon's modern plumbing, the house has running water, which is a luxury. The kitchen still depends on constant manual labor. Housemaids move through the reception rooms, cleaning grates, laying fresh fires, dusting furniture that was dusted yesterday and will be dusted again tomorrow. The work is repetitive, exhausting, invisible when done correctly. The butler oversees it all. At Waddesdon, his position carries real authority. He manages the male staff, footmen. Under butlers, hall boys. He controls the wine cellar, one of the finest private collections in England. He choreographs service for dinners that might seat 20 guests across a long sequence of courses. Below stairs, his word is law. The housekeeper holds equivalent power over the women. She directs the housemaids, ladies' maids, laundry workers. She keeps linen inventories, inspects bedrooms, checks that every surface shines. Her standards are unforgiving, a streak on a mirror. A crease in a bedsheet, dust in a corner, any of these could mean dismissal. This is not Ferdinand's personal cruelty. It is simply how great houses function. Servants are expected to be invisible and flawless. The two demands reinforce each other. To stay unseen, you have to do your work so precisely that no one ever notices you doing it. The hierarchy below stairs is rigid. At the top, butler and housekeeper. Just beneath them, valets and ladies' maids who dress the family and guests, handle personal possessions, maintain wardrobes. Below that layer, footmen and housemaids. Lower still, kitchen staff. And at the very bottom, scullery maids and hall boys. Teenagers doing the filthiest work for the smallest pay. Everyone knows their place. Crossing a boundary means consequences. Servants' meals are taken in shifts in the servants' hall, a large room in the basement. Even here, status dictates everything. Upper servants, butler, housekeeper, valets, ladies' maids eat apart from the rest. They have better food, served on better crockery, at a table where conversation is allowed. Lower servants eat more quickly, speak less, go straight back to their tasks. The bell system controls movement like a nervous system. Every major room upstairs has a bell pull. When someone tugs it, a corresponding bell jingles downstairs in the servants' corridor. Springs and wires run through the walls, connecting the two worlds. Each bell has its own tone. Experienced staff can identify the calling room by sound alone. When a bell rings, somebody moves immediately. The family and their guests do not wait. What the servants actually thought of their employers is only partly visible. A handful of letters survive. A few diaries. Occasional notes in household ledgers. Put together, they form a complicated picture. By contemporary standards, the Rothschilds paid well. Better than many aristocratic houses. The work was exhausting, the hours long, but the wages were competitive and generally on time. Some servants stayed for decades, which suggests they found the conditions acceptable, maybe even preferable to factory work or domestic service in harsher households, yet the awareness of difference never disappeared. The Rothschilds were foreign, Jewish. Staff understood that this shaped how the outside world saw their employers, and indirectly how it saw them for serving in a Rothschild house. Some took pride in that association. Working at Waddesdon meant working at one of the great houses of England. The Prince of Wales slept in beds they had made. Cabinet ministers ate food they had carried. That kind of reflected prestige mattered, even if it was second-hand and conditional. Others were more conflicted. Letters from former employees describe the family as kind enough or fair, but also demanding and very particular. The implication is clear. This was a job, not a kinship. The relationship was transactional, respect existed, but it flowed mostly in one direction. Up and beneath everything lay the basic imbalance of power. A servant could be dismissed for almost anything. An error, a complaint, a clash with a superior. Dismissal meant instant loss of income and housing. Most lived on the estate, and worst of all, loss of a reference. Without a good reference, finding another position became nearly impossible. The Rothschilds were not notorious tyrants. By most accounts, they treated staff better than many of their peers, but kindness from a position of total control is still a form of control. A gentle master is still a master. The servants at Waddesdon kept the whole machine running. They maintained the illusion that wealth and beauty existed naturally. That fireplaces lit themselves. That 12-course meals appeared without planning or sweat. They enabled Ferdinand's performance of belonging, and later James's performance of continuity. They did all of this knowing that no matter how critical their work was, they would never dine in the great hall upstairs, never sit and read in the library, never own anything remotely like the objects they cleaned and polished every day. That was the bargain. That was how old money operated. Not just as accumulated capital, but as accumulated invisible labor. Other people's effort built into the walls and then written out of the story. The house still stands. The servants' bells still hang in the corridors below. Silent now, part of the museum displays, but once they rang constantly, and whenever they did, someone ran. The servants knew their place in the hierarchy. The Rothschilds knew theirs too. It was just less clearly marked, and far more dangerous. In 1898, the same year Ferdinand dies, a cartoon appears in a French newspaper. It shows a grotesque figure with exaggerated features, hooked nose, clawed hands, wrapped around a globe labeled World Finance. The caption names it simply Rothschild. This is nothing unusual. Caricatures like this appear regularly across Europe, in Germany, in Austria, in France, in England. The details change slightly. Sometimes the figure clutches money bags. Sometimes puppet strings attached to tiny politicians. Sometimes both at once. But the message never shifts. The Rothschilds as sinister inhuman forces secretly controlling world events. These are not underground leaflets. They run in mainstream newspapers, in popular magazines sold on street corners, in political pamphlets passed around in parliaments. The anti-Semitism is casual, normalized, woven into everyday public life, and yet the Prince of Wales keeps visiting Waddesdon. Queen Victoria had attended Rothschild weddings. The family holds titles: Baron Ferdinand, Baron Lionel, Baron Nathaniel, granted by the British Crown and other European monarchs. They are on guest lists for state occasions. Their donations fund hospitals, schools, parks. Buildings in London and Paris carry their name. This is the paradox. The Rothschilds live inside it constantly, essential and despised, welcomed and mocked, powerful and exposed. The English aristocracy embodies that contradiction perfectly. They come to Waddesdon's parties. They admire the collections. They ask for financial help. They turn to Rothschild banks when their own estates need rescuing. Some even marry Rothschild daughters when the dowries are large enough to patch their finances. And then they go home and joke about it. The language is often coded. Memoirs and letters refer to our Israelite friends. Descriptions of Rothschild houses mention Oriental taste. Compliments on hospitality arrive with subtle qualifiers. This is not quite English style, not quite the same as a weekend with the Duke of Devonshire. The Rothschilds hear all of it. They are too sharp, too plugged in not to. Ferdinand reads the papers. He sees the cartoons. He receives letters from relatives on the continent describing worse. Street attacks, boycotts, new rules restricting Jewish businesses, political campaigns built entirely on hostility to Jewish wealth. His answer is to build higher, to refine further, to make Waddesdon so magnificent it cannot be brushed aside. If they are going to sneer anyway, let them sneer at a Renaissance chateau full of masterpieces their own families had been forced to sell to pay debts. This is defensive architecture, not just stone walls and towers, but taste and elegance sharpened into a shield against prejudice. Every flawless dinner party is an exhibit. Every royal visit is another line of evidence. See, the house seems to insist. Look at what we have created. Look how well we understand your world. Look how we belong. But belonging bought through perfection is exhausting, because once perfection becomes the entry ticket, it has to be maintained. Always, one scandal, one misstep, one moment of seeming too Jewish or too foreign or too aggressively wealthy in the wrong context, and the fragile acceptance could shatter. The Rothschilds cannot afford to be merely competent. They have to be exceptional in every direction. Their houses have to be more impressive, their parties more polished, their philanthropy more visible, their business dealings more discreet. Any failure seems to confirm what the cartoons already claim, that they are outsiders playing dress-up as aristocrats. That pressure seeps into everything, into the obsessive attention to detail at Waddesdon, into the carefully curated guest lists, into the political donations spread across parties so that whoever wins elections, someone at the top will feel indebted to the family, into the strategy of marrying within the clan, keeping money and influence tightly contained, into the disciplined silence whenever a new caricature appears. Never complain, never explain, never feed the fire. It is a survival strategy wearing the mask of effortless success, and it works, to a point. The family keeps its power, Waddesdon keeps its sheen. The banking network keeps humming. Underneath, though, is a constant awareness that none of it is guaranteed, that invitations could dry up, that honors could be withdrawn, that the foundations under the castle are conditional in a way they are not for families whose names run back through the Doomsday Book. The English aristocracy traces some of their lineages to knights who crossed the Channel with William the Conqueror in 1066. The Rothschild story runs through Frankfurt's Jewish ghetto. Streets where Jews had been locked in at night, restricted in trade, treated as permanent outsiders by law. Ferdinand has been gone less than a generation from that world. But the family carries that memory like a second spine. It shapes their instincts, their defensive posture, their relentless need for control and polish. History has taught them that safety is always temporary, that being loved and hated at the same time is normal, that you can own a palace and still not fully own your place in the country around it. The caricatures keep appearing, the invitations keep arriving, and the Rothschilds keep walking the same impossible line, visible enough to matter, not so visible as to become the perfect enemy, wealthy enough to be respected, not so ostentatiously wealthy that resentment boils over, Jewish enough to remain themselves, not so openly Jewish that Christian society turns away. It is a balance no one could keep forever. And then the world breaks. The balancing act ends in August 1914. When war erupts across Europe, the Rothschild banking network designed to float above borders built on blood ties between capitals suddenly becomes impossible to operate as before. Nations demand clear loyalty. You are British or German or French or Austrian. You cannot be all of them at once. The family has branches in London, Paris, Vienna, Frankfurt. Cousins who have worked together for decades wake up to find themselves on opposite sides of the same conflict. The London Rothschilds are now British. The Vienna and Frankfurt Rothschilds belong to the Central Powers. The Paris Rothschilds are French. The same family, different uniforms, different flags. This creates situations with no good answers. Lionel Walter Rothschild, Ferdinand's nephew, is a British citizen with close relatives in Germany. In public, he supports the British war effort without hesitation. At the same time, some of his cousins see their businesses labeled enemy assets. Not because of anything they have done, but because of where they live. What do you do when your own family is officially the enemy? The practical answer is you stop talking. The London house cuts formal communication with Vienna and Frankfurt. Business ties that have worked smoothly for nearly a century are suspended or quietly unwound. Family network, which had once been their greatest competitive advantage, turns into a danger. Each branch now has to prove loyalty to its own government. And the easiest way to do that is to act as if the others do not exist. Beneath that, a deeper crack is forming. War tears into the illusion of safety that places like Waddesdon had been built to project. The estate itself lies far from any front line. Buckinghamshire will not see German troops. No trenches are dug through Ferdinand's gardens. No shells land on his towers, but the war still arrives, carried by the men who leave and do not return. Waddesdon's staff shrinks brutally. Footmen and hall boys enlist. Gardeners join up. The under-butler, the second footman, 3 of the stable hands, all sign their names at recruiting offices and go to France. Some come back with wounds, some come back in coffins, some never come back at all. Their names are chiseled into the estate's war memorial, raised after the fighting ends. A simple stone. The list carved in alphabetical order. No separation between servants and family. In death, for once, the hierarchy falls silent. The house keeps going, but only just. James de Rothschild, who has inherited Waddesdon from his mother Alice, enlists himself. He serves with distinction, is wounded, returns to duty. While he is away, the château sits mostly empty. A reduced staff keeps it alive in slow motion, fires lit, basic maintenance done. Waiting for a version of the world that will never fully come back. The damage to the wider Rothschild web is far worse. The Vienna branch, once among the most powerful, is hammered by the collapse of Austria-Hungary. Properties are seized, assets frozen or written down to nothing. The Frankfurt house faces similar pressure inside a defeated Germany. What had taken 100 years to assemble fractures along sharp national lines that had barely existed when the system was first built. And under all this lies a brutal realization. Money cannot insulate anyone from industrialized slaughter. The Rothschilds have financed railways and governments. They have underwritten national debts, built palaces, bought masterpieces. They have entertained princes and prime ministers beneath ceilings painted in gold. None of that matters to machine guns and high-explosive shells. When millions of men are mobilized to kill and be killed, no château on a hill can guarantee that its staff or its owners will be spared. Ferdinand's dream of security through success looks increasingly fragile. You can build the perfect house on an English hill, fill it with beauty and hand-picked guests, prove over and over that you have taste and status and a claim to belong. And then war arrives, and boys who polished your silver die in French mud. And your family's transnational business is ripped apart along battle lines, and all that perfection reveals how little it could actually control. The moral complexity of the family's position becomes harder to ignore. The Rothschilds have helped issue the bonds that funded the war on multiple sides. British war loans, French government borrowing, post-war reconstruction issues. They earn fees and interest from the mechanisms of war, even as those same mechanisms destroy people they know. They are not alone in this. Most major banks do the same, but the Rothschild name makes them a perfect target. During and after the war, anti-Semitic propagandists claim Jewish financiers caused the conflict. Old caricatures grow sharper. New posters and pamphlets push even wilder stories. The Rothschilds are accused of profiting from Christian bloodshed, of manipulating cabinets into war purely for gain. Some accusations land close to an uncomfortable truth, though not in the way the agitators mean. The family does profit from war finance. So do British banks, German banks, French banks. The difference is that when Christian-owned banks earn money from war, it can be framed as patriotic service. When Jewish-owned banks do the same, it is proof, supposedly, of a hidden plot. When James returns to Waddesdon after 1918, he finds a house that is both unchanged and completely different. The walls are still standing, the collections are still in place. The gardens can be coaxed back into perfect order, but the staff is thinner, the atmosphere is heavier. The parties resume, but they now carry a different undertone, less certainty, less belief that the world can be bent into shape through charm, precision, and performance. The memorial to the dead servant stands in the grounds, a quiet, stubborn reminder that the château has failed its deepest promise. It had been built to symbolize protection. Safety, distance from chaos. Yet chaos had arrived anyway, and it had taken young men who had laid fires, polished silver, served wine, and trimmed hedges, men who had kept the illusion running. Their names in stone are now the most honest thing on the estate, fixed, unarguable, permanent in a way that Ferdinand's social engineering had never truly been. The war ends in 1918, but for Waddesdon and for the family who raised it, something basic has been shattered. The belief that wealth could purchase lasting safety is gone, and beyond the horizon, something even worse is gathering. The parties come back, but they are different now. James de Rothschild reopens Waddesdon fully in the early 1920s. The house is scrubbed from attic to basement. The gardens are coaxed back into symmetry. Staff are rehired, though never quite to pre-war numbers. The chandeliers blaze again. Guests return for weekends that on the surface look remarkably like the ones Ferdinand had hosted 3 decades earlier. But underneath the shine, everyone can feel how thin it has become. The interwar years are strange for places like Waddesdon. On one hand, there is a kind of stubborn glamour. Fast cars now pull up on the drive. Rolls-Royces, Bentleys, gleaming machines that make the old carriages look like museum pieces. Jazz crackles from gramophones. Women's hemlines rise. Cocktails begin to edge out the rigid multi-course Victorian dinners, although those still appear when the occasion demands ceremony. This is modernity arriving at the château. New money mixing with old. American heiresses buying European titles. Social rules loosening where once they had been carved in stone. In theory, this should make life easier for the Rothschilds if the old barriers are lowering, if society is opening up. Then a family of Jewish bankers with a French chateau in England ought to fit more naturally into the scene. But anti-Semitism is modernizing too. In Germany, the Weimar Republic lurches between inflation, coups, and street violence. The Nazis start as a fringe party in the early 1920s. Then they grow, then they turn into a serious threat. Their propaganda fixates on Jewish finance, and it gives it a face. They do not talk about bankers in the abstract. They use names. Rothschild appears again and again in their pamphlets and speeches. Shorthand for everything they claim is poisoning Germany. There is nothing subtle about it. Nazi newspapers print lists of Jewish-owned businesses to boycott, directories of Jewish professionals to avoid, brochures and posters that openly call for Jewish wealth and influence to be smashed. The Rothschilds sit at the top of many of these lists, perfect symbols for a hatred that needs an easy target. News of this reaches Waddesdon in letters from relatives still in Frankfurt and Vienna. The tone darkens with each year. Business restrictions, exclusion from clubs and societies, beatings in the street, shop windows smashed. The German and Austrian branches of the family are under growing pressure. Properties are seized under legal pretexts, bank accounts frozen. The machinery of the state is being turned, step by step, against Jewish money. James reads these letters in the Waddesdon Library, the same room where Ferdinand had once entertained the Prince of Wales, where ministers had talked policy over brandy and cigars, where the illusion of rock-solid security had been carefully curated. That illusion is cracking across the continent. In France, where another major branch of the family operates, the situation looks different but is hardly comfortable. French anti-Semitism has its own flavor, less overtly violent than what is developing in Germany, but persistent. Deeply rooted, the Dreyfus affair of the 1890s had already shown how quickly accusations against a single Jewish officer could tear the country apart. The Paris Rothschilds carry on, maintaining their bank and their social position. But they do so with increasing caution. England still feels safer. British anti-Semitism certainly exists. The drawing room jokes, the club doors that stay closed, the casual slights, they have never vanished. But it does not yet have the systematized, state-driven brutality that is forming in Germany and Austria. British Jews face prejudice and ceilings, not organized elimination. Waddesdon begins to function more and more as a refuge. Family members come from France, from Austria, from Germany, cousins whose businesses have been undermined, relatives who have been pushed out of positions or harassed in the streets. The house that Ferdinand built to prove that Rothschilds belonged in European high society now doubles as a safe house for relatives being told, loudly and officially, that they do not belong anywhere. The gatherings take on a double life. On weekends with British guests, everything looks normal. Guns on the pegs in the morning, shooting parties in the fields, formal dinners, conversation flowing under the chandeliers. The full performance of aristocratic leisure stays in place. On quieter weeks, when only family are present, the mood shifts. Conversations in the same drawing rooms turn to escape routes and deadlines. What to do with the Frankfurt house, whether to pull out of Vienna entirely, how to move vulnerable relatives to London or Paris before borders tighten further. James tries to keep both worlds going. The public Waddesdon, elegant, generous, plugged into British politics and culture. And the private Waddesdon, an operations room for a family under pressure, drawing up survival plans in spaces designed for entertainment. The art collection Ferdinand had assembled with such care now carries a second meaning. These are no longer only beautiful things to hang on walls and place on pedestals. They are condensed, portable wealth, assets that can be moved quickly, hidden if necessary, or sold to fund escape. Paintings start to travel quietly to London vaults, to Paris storerooms, where they might be safer than on the walls of houses under threat. By the mid-1930s, no one can pretend not to see what is happening in Germany. Hitler is in power. The Nuremberg laws strip Jews of citizenship and rights. The Frankfurt Rothschild Bank, the home branch where Mayor Amschel had once lent coins from a small house, is forced to close. That ancestral house is seized. Then comes November 1938. Letters and cables arrive at Waddesdon describing Kristallnacht. Synagogues burning, Jewish shops smashed and looted, men dragged from their homes and beaten in the streets. It is not random fury. It is coordinated, state-directed violence. James convenes a family meeting at Waddesdon in late 1938. The agenda is brutally simple. Survival, how to get remaining relatives out of Germany and Austria, how to protect what assets can still be moved, how to keep the still functioning parts of the banking empire alive while accepting that some branches will have to be abandoned. The château, sitting on its English hill, feels both sheltered and exposed. Geographically, it is far from the worst of the violence, but symbolically, it is exactly the sort of place fascists love to point at. Visible Jewish wealth built to project influence. The very features that had made Waddesdon a triumph now make it a perfect target in any narrative about Jewish power. The beauty of the place does not fade. The gardens are still clipped into precise patterns, the fountains still play, the pictures still shine behind glass, but it is beauty on thin ice. Everyone can sense the cracks, even if they cannot yet see how deep they run. By 1939, the question is no longer whether war will return to Europe. It is what and who will still be standing when it is over. Ferdinand had built Waddesdon to last forever, to nail down permanence, to prove that the Rothschilds belonged in Europe as much as any family with a coat of arms older than the printing press. Roughly 60 years later, Europe is preparing to tear itself apart again. And this time, the Rothschilds are not just convenient symbols in cartoons. They are being named explicitly as enemies. The lights at Waddesdon will go out again soon. This time, nobody can be sure they will ever come back on. The blackout order comes in September 1939. Every window at Waddesdon has to be covered. Heavy curtains go up. Tape is stretched across panes in X patterns to reduce shattering from blast. The chandeliers that had once symbolized Ferdinand's victory over darkness, electric light blazing in the countryside when nearby villages still relied on gas, go dark. The house becomes a shadow of itself. James de Rothschild joins the military again. Even though he is in his 40s, he had served in the First World War, been wounded, gone back. Now he is doing it all over again. The family's London house is shut. Waddesdon becomes the main refuge, but only in a stripped-down, hollow version of what it had been. Most of the staff are gone, enlisted, conscripted, drawn into factories now turning out weapons instead of goods for peacetime. The skeleton crew left behind keeps only the basics alive, maintaining the structure, stopping damp from eating the walls, keeping the grounds from collapsing entirely. The formal gardens are largely abandoned. The greenhouses that had once produced exotic flowers for Ferdinand's weekend parties are turned over to growing vegetables. It is practical, and it is symbolic. The house built to showcase refinement now concentrates on simple survival. Then a quiet request comes from the British government. The National Gallery in London needs safe storage. German bombing raids threaten the capital's museums. Priceless paintings and sculptures need to be moved out to places that can be secured and kept dry, cool, and stable. Waddesdon, with its thick walls, strong rooms, and distance from the city, is ideal. Crates arrive in 1940, carefully packed canvases, sculptures wrapped in protective materials, works by Rembrandt, Gainsborough, Reynolds. Pieces that define British cultural identity, hidden in the basement of a house built by Jewish immigrants to prove they understood European culture as well as anyone. No one involved misses the irony. The house becomes a strange hybrid, part empty mansion, part military staging area. Troops are occasionally billeted on the grounds, part secret vault for a national collection. The grand entrance hall, where Ferdinand had once entertained princes, now holds stacked crates marked with inventory numbers instead of guests in evening dress. Meanwhile, across Europe, the family's worst fears are coming true. The Paris Rothschild mansion is seized by the Nazis in 1940 after France falls. German officers take over the rooms. Hermann Goering personally chooses pieces from the Rothschild collection for his private hoard. The theft is not random looting. It is planned. Written down, enforced by the Nazi state. Vienna properties have already been taken. The Frankfurt house is destroyed. Relatives who have not escaped are murdered. The exact number will never be fully known. Holocaust records are incomplete. Some were deliberately erased, but Rothschild family members die in camps. The name that had once stood for wealth and power offers no protection against a system built to exterminate. Letters reach Waddesdon slowly through neutral countries and delayed channels. Each envelope brings worse news. Cousins missing. Homes emptied, businesses dissolved by decree, bank accounts drained under the cover of law. The European network that had taken 5 generations to build is being methodically dismantled. James, serving in British uniform, receives these updates between duties. The mental whiplash is brutal. He is fighting to defend Europe while learning that Europe is wiping out his family's place within it. Fighting for civilization while that same civilization reveals what it is capable of doing. Waddesdon itself stands. The roof is intact. The walls hold. The pictures stored in its basement survive without damage. But the world it embodied, the belief that money, art, and careful social choreography could create lasting safety, is gone. Some Rothschilds who escaped to England spend time at Waddesdon during the war. Refugees in a house their own relatives had built to announce arrival. The château finally becomes what it had always threatened to become. Not a symbol of having been accepted, but an actual fortress. Not a statement of belonging, but a place to hide. The village sees the war differently. Ration books, sirens, blackouts, sons and brothers away at the front, but they also watch Waddesdon change. The grand estate that had seemed separate from ordinary life is now part of the national emergency. The Rothschilds, long whispered about as foreign and suspect, are suddenly visible on the same side as everyone else. That does not erase centuries of anti-Semitism, but it complicates the story. It is hard to claim the Rothschilds are disloyal when James wears British khaki and Waddesdon's cellars shelter paintings the whole country claims as its own. By 1945, the war in Europe is staggering to an end. The crates in Waddesdon's basement are opened and sent back to London. The National Gallery reclaims its works unharmed. The house has done its job. It has protected what was placed in its care. Yet when James comes home and walks the echoing rooms, the victory feels thin. The building stands. The British branch of the family has survived, but the web that had once stretched across Europe is shattered. Continental branches are gone or gutted. Family members are dead, properties erased. The banking empire that had once slipped easily over borders is now confined to a handful of countries where Rothschilds still have a foothold. Ferdinand's château has survived the war in stone and slate. But the world it had been built for, the aristocratic, cosmopolitan Europe where powerful families could operate above nations, has vanished. What do you do with a palace designed for a world that no longer exists? That question will shape the next chapter of Waddesdon's story. First, someone has to decide whether keeping it is even possible. James walks through Waddesdon in 1945 and sees a problem with no obvious solution. The house is structurally sound, the art collection intact. The grounds could be revived with enough money, time, and staff, but the economic reality is brutal. Keeping a chateau of this size alive requires an enormous flow of cash, and in the new world, that expense needs a reason. Before the war, the justification had been clear. Waddesdon was social infrastructure for the family's banking power, a stage for entertaining, for building relationships, for reinforcing the Rothschild position in British high society. The house was not just a cost, it was a tool, an investment in influence and access. Post-war Britain is something else entirely. The aristocratic system Ferdinand had spent his life trying to break into is collapsing. Inheritance taxes and death duties are smashing landed estates across the country. Country houses are being stripped, abandoned, demolished, or handed over as schools, hospitals, military colleges. The great weekend house parties are ending, not because people have stopped wanting them, but because almost nobody can afford to host them. The Rothschild banking operations have survived, but in a reduced, reshaped form. The old European network is fractured. The need for a grand English estate to impress continental cousins and clients has largely vanished. Many of those cousins are dead or scattered. Those clients are now dealing with new institutions in a new financial order. On paper, James has obvious options. He could sell Waddesdon, find a buyer willing to shoulder the maintenance, break up or auction the collection, turn the house over to an institution and walk away. Other families in similar positions are doing exactly that every month, but there is someone who cannot accept that answer. Dorothy de Rothschild, James's wife, sees something else when she looks at Waddesdon. She understands that it is more than a beautiful, expensive problem. It is a document in stone and wood, a record of a particular moment in European history, a monument to what a Jewish banking family had built and what it had survived, evidence of extraordinary success and at the same time of deep vulnerability. To simply sell it off or let it decay feels like tearing out a chapter of history. Yet keeping it as a private family house feels increasingly unrealistic. The solution they move toward is radical for its era. Collaborate with the National Trust, a British organization created to preserve places of historic importance. Shift Waddesdon from private palace to public heritage. This is not a simple act of charity. The negotiations are detailed and tough. The family will keep certain rights and a voice in how things are done. The house will be preserved to agreed standards. The core of the art collection will stay together on site. Public access will be offered, but carefully controlled, so that the property is protected even as people who would never have been invited in Ferdinand's day can finally walk through the rooms. Agreeing to this means admitting something Ferdinand had spent his life resisting. That Waddesdon's greatest value now lies in its historical meaning, not in its use as a private status symbol. That its significance goes beyond the family. That the surest way to save what he had created is to surrender exclusive ownership of it. James dies in 1957 before the full transition can be completed. Dorothy carries the project forward. The formal arrangement with the National Trust is finalized in the 1950s, though the family stays involved in management and continues to add pieces to the collections. Waddesdon acquires a new identity, no longer a private residence performing aristocratic belonging. Instead, a museum and heritage site trying at first cautiously to acknowledge its layered history while preserving its visual splendor. But real preservation demands honesty, and honesty means asking questions that earlier generations had mostly avoided. What exactly had Ferdinand been doing when he built this place? How specifically had the money been earned that paid for every stone and painting? Where are the stories of the people downstairs, the servants whose labor had made the illusion of effortless luxury possible? How did anti-Semitism shape the family's choices? What compromises had they made to survive inside a system that never fully accepted them? For decades after opening to visitors, the official story stays on safe ground. Guides talk about the architecture, the provenance of the paintings, the brilliance of Ferdinand's taste. Guests walk through rooms hearing about French furniture, Sevres porcelain, and Renaissance portraits. Almost nothing about the lives lived here or the political storms raging outside the windows. It is comfortable history, beautiful history, a version of the past that lets people admire wealth and culture without having to think too hard about how either was acquired. It is also incomplete. As time passes and new historians and curators take charge, pressure grows to widen the frame. The archives are opened properly. Boxes in attics and storerooms are examined. Servant records are read. Letters between family members decoded. Account books combed through. Slowly, a different picture comes into focus. Ferdinand was not just a refined collector. He was a man marked by illness and grief, building a fortress against loss and rejection. The weekend parties were not just scenes of elegance. They were calculated performances designed to purchase a sense of belonging that remained conditional. The servants were not anonymous staff. They were individuals with names, hopes, and sharply limited choices, working inside a hierarchy that exploited their labor, however relatively kind their employers might have been. The house begins to tell these stories too, not to erase the beauty but to frame it, not to deny Ferdinand's achievements but to ask what they cost, to whom, and why. Change is gradual and not without resistance. Some visitors want the fairy tale version. The glowing château, the dazzling dinners, the simple narrative of exceptional taste and success. Others want the fuller account. The whole tangled, morally complicated story of what old money actually involves and what it demands from everyone caught up in its orbit. Freed from its old job as a private palace, Waddesdon can finally become what it had always had the potential to be. Evidence. A physical record. A place where the past is preserved not just to be admired, but to be understood. The open question is whether people are willing to listen to that full story once the doors have been opened wide enough to let it be told. The attic at Waddesdon holds secrets no one has seriously examined. Boxes of papers, decades of household accounts, employment records for servants whose names have never appeared in glossy guidebooks. Letters between family members discussing subjects that have been carefully excluded from the polished stories told to visitors. Invoices listing, line by line, how much Ferdinand paid for every chandelier, every painting, every stone in the façade. In the 1990s and 2000s, a new generation of curators and historians begins working through this material systematically. What they find complicates every neat story about the house. The servant records are especially revealing. Names. Ages, positions, wages, reasons for hiring and dismissal. Over the decades, hundreds of people have worked at Waddesdon. Most stay only a few years, some remain for 20 or 30. A few are dismissed for reasons that range from understandable, persistent theft, chronic unreliability, to chilling, pregnancy, which meant automatic termination for many women regardless of circumstance. The wage books are precise. A head housemaid in the 1890s earns roughly £30 per year. A scullery maid earns about 12. The butler draws closer to 80 plus accommodation and food. For the period, these are competitive rates, better than what many aristocratic estates offer, but context changes everything. Ferdinand routinely spends thousands of pounds on a single painting. In some years, the entire annual wage bill for the household comes to less than the price of one major work of art. That sort of disparity is typical of the time. Yet seeing it laid out in columns of ink makes the class hierarchy feel brutally concrete in a way that soft phrases like skilled domestic staff never had. The private letters between family members expose anxieties the public Waddesdon has always hidden. Ferdinand writing about his isolation in England. About drawing-room anti-Semitism he encounters even among people happy to dine at his table. About knowing that no matter how perfect the house, a part of British society will always see him as foreign and suspect. Later letters from the interwar years trace the rising fear around European anti-Semitism, discussions about shifting assets, worries about cousins in Germany and Austria, careful calculations about how publicly Jewish to be. Too visible and you become a convenient target. Too invisible and you risk losing community, identity, and leverage. These discoveries are uncomfortable. They shatter the idea of Waddesdon as a straightforward success story, but they are crucial. They show that even immense wealth could not fully shield a Jewish family from the prejudices of their era, that the performance of belonging was relentless, exhausting, and never quite complete, that the castle on the hill had always been more fragile than it looked from the drive. Curators now have a choice. Keep telling the sanitized version, gorgeous house, impeccable taste, the end. Or thread these tougher truths into tour and exhibitions. They choose to widen the story. Gradually, carefully, but deliberately, new interpretive panels appear, texts that name and describe the servants who kept the house running. Exhibitions that explore Ferdinand's experience as a Jewish immigrant in Victorian England. Tour that talk frankly about the family's wartime history, both as targets of Nazi persecution and as contributors to Britain's war effort. For some visitors, this is unwelcome. They arrived wanting a fairy tale, elegant rooms, glittering chandeliers, an uncomplicated fantasy of how the other half lived. They do not want to think about class exploitation, religious prejudice, or the moral tangle of banking fortunes. Others react very differently. Younger visitors in particular respond strongly to the honesty. They appreciate that the house is not pretending, that it acknowledges the servant's labor, that it names the prejudice Ferdinand faced, that it dares to ask what all this beauty cost and who ultimately paid. Waddesdon begins working with scholars whose topics it had once avoided, labor historians studying Victorian domestic service, researchers documenting anti-Semitism in Britain, specialists in the history of wealth, inequality, and old money. The house opens its archives and invites difficult questions instead of dodging them. Some findings surprise even the curators. Evidence that Ferdinand, on certain issues, was more progressive than many of his peers, supporting women's education, funding scholarships and civic projects. Alongside that sits evidence of the everyday cruelty baked into the system he inhabited. Servants dismissed without references for minor infractions, effectively blacklisted. Lives overturned by decisions taken in a moment by employers who would never see the consequences. The continuing involvement of the Rothschild family means these revelations require tact. This is still, in an important sense, their story. Yet to their credit, the family largely backs the more honest approach. They understand that real respect comes from telling the whole story, not just the flattering fragments. Dorothy de Rothschild's decision to bring in the National Trust has made this evolution possible. Once Waddesdon stops functioning as a private residence serving current family needs, it is no longer necessary to maintain a flawless social facade. The pressure to use the house as a live status symbol eases. What remains is history. Messy, morally ambiguous, deeply revealing history. The kind that resists simple heroes and villains and instead shows real people making hard choices inside structures that constrained everyone, but trapped some far more tightly than others. Waddesdon is not alone in this reckoning. Historic houses across Britain are also re-examining their origins, acknowledging the labor that built them, the colonial and financial systems that funded them, the hierarchies that kept them going. Yet Waddesdon adds layers many other estates lack. The Jewish story, the immigrant story, the particular vulnerability of being both extremely wealthy and persistently targeted. The way anti-Semitism and class shaped every decision, even for those with staggering resources. The tour change, the exhibitions shift. The house becomes less about uncritically celebrating old money and more about examining it, taking it apart, understanding its mechanics and consequences, and asking what lessons it leaves behind. Some visitors still come simply to see beautiful rooms. That is fine. The rooms are still beautiful, but more and more people arrive wanting to know what those rooms mean. What they stand for, what and whom they cost, who built them, who served in them, and what happened to all of those people when the music stopped. At last, the house is prepared to answer, fully, honestly, and without looking away. Walk into almost any movie about aristocratic wealth and you will recognize Waddesdon, not necessarily the literal house but the template, the long gravel drive cutting through manicured parkland, the slow approach, the sudden reveal of a massive château against the sky. Tall windows glowing at dusk, staff in formal uniforms gliding through perfectly staged rooms, the instant visual shorthand for what old money is supposed to look like. Waddesdon helped invent that visual language before cinema existed. Once cameras arrived, the pattern Ferdinand created became the pattern everyone copied. Downton Abbey, Brideshead Revisited, Gosford Park. The crown, Countless period dramas filmed in English country houses that all feel familiar. Even when they are not shooting at Waddesdon, they are borrowing its mood. French-style façades, sweeping steps, formal terraces, interiors arranged like a lifestyle catalog for inherited wealth. The look is so entrenched it seems natural, inevitable, like great fortunes have always expressed themselves in French Renaissance stone, clipped lawns, and silent servants. They have not. This look was invented, carefully, by people like Ferdinand who needed to prove a point. The English aristocracy already had its own architectural grammar. Georgian boxes, Palladian villas, genuinely medieval castles. They did not need to imitate France. Their houses announced lineage, not taste. The architecture said, "We have been here longer than anyone can remember." Ferdinand's generation of outsiders could not say that. So they made different claims, not ancient bloodline but flawless taste, not centuries of inheritance but mastery of culture. Not "we have always been here, but we understand Europe better than you think." The French château style was perfect for this. It said, "I know the codes of civilization so well I can lift them from the Loire and replant them on an English hill." It worked so effectively that it became the global template. American Gilded Age tycoons copied the playbook. The Vanderbilts built Biltmore in North Carolina, an even bigger French château intentionally modeled on Loire Valley houses, the Astors. The Rockefellers, the rest of the industrial fortunes, all gravitated toward European styles that screamed sophistication instead of frontier money. They were doing exactly what Ferdinand had done, using architecture as a resume, turning buildings into credentials that said, "This is not just cash, this is culture." Today, Instagram and social media amplify the same script. Waddesdon's official feeds show it to hundreds of thousands of people. The same set pieces, the gardens in autumn. Christmas lights wrapped around stone. The fountain at Blue Hour. Every image reinforces the aesthetic. This is elegance. This is aspiration. This is what success should look like. What those posts rarely show is everything you have just followed through 10 chapters. They do not show Ferdinand pacing the house at night, aware the building will never fully buy the belonging he wants. They do not show servants stumbling out of bed before dawn to make sure luxury looks effortless by lunchtime. They do not show the anti-Semitic caricatures, the confiscated houses, the emergency family meetings about escape routes when Europe turns lethal. The aesthetic is gorgeous. The context is ruthless. That gap between image and reality is what old money has always depended on. The performance works because most people only ever see the costume. They see the facade, not the calculation. The lawns, not the labor. The glamorous dinner, not the anxiety humming under the table. Knowing this does not make Waddesdon less impressive. If anything, it makes it sharper. The house stops being just a pretty backdrop and becomes a document, a case study in how wealth performs legitimacy, how outsiders manufacture belonging, how power dresses itself up as taste. Modern viewers binging Downton Abbey or buying tickets to tour Waddesdon are stepping straight into a fantasy that people like Ferdinand helped design. The fantasy says there was once a time when wealth was noble and tidy, when the rich were gracious, when servants and masters accepted their roles, when the system worked. It never actually worked like that. Servants resented their limits and feared dismissal. Employers worried constantly about status, scandal, and collapse. The machine produced beauty by burning through human effort and calling it order. Yet the fantasy hangs on because the aesthetic is addictive. French chateaux on English hills really are beautiful. Candlelit dining rooms look incredible on camera. The idea that old money is fundamentally refined and tasteful, rather than what it usually is, which is accumulated power over generations, often built through extractive or morally gray systems, is comforting. Waddesdon throws a question back at you. If you had Ferdinand's resources, what would you build? Another palace begging for approval from people who will never fully accept you? Something that admits what wealth really is? Something designed to share instead of dazzle? That question is not hypothetical for anyone with money or with ambitions toward it. Social media is full of miniature Waddesdons, curated interiors, immaculate table settings, candid photos staged to signal status. The props are cheaper now, ring lights instead of crystal chandeliers, rental villas instead of private estates. But the impulse is the same: perform legitimacy, prove you belong. Ferdinand wanted to belong so badly he turned a hill into a statement. Waddesdon is still here. Still stunning, still doing its original job of making wealth look like culture. But now we know what sat behind the performance. We have read the ledgers, we have glimpsed the servants' lives, We have seen how vulnerable the family remained even at the height of their power. We have watched the world that gave the house meaning collapse, and watched the mansion survive as evidence instead of fantasy. The mansion helped fix the image of old money in the global imagination. The image is beautiful. The reality is complicated. Beauty does not cancel that complexity. It just makes it a little easier to look away. The visitor pauses at the gates and looks back one more time. What Waddesdon offers now is something Ferdinand never aimed for, but maybe more valuable than what he imagined. Not a polished fantasy of perfection, but a clear look at complexity. Not a shrine to old money, but a place to learn what old money actually was and what it did. The house teaches uncomfortable lessons. That wealth does not guarantee safety. That acceptance bought through performance is fragile and exhausting. That beauty usually sits on top of invisible labor. That systems can exploit people even when some of the individuals inside them mean well. That you can be powerful and vulnerable at the same time. And that this tension can shape whole eras. But the house also carries a quieter kind of hope, because Waddesdon did not freeze in the role Ferdinand gave it. Dorothy de Rothschild chose preservation over private comfort. Curators chose to unlock boxes instead of leaving them to gather dust. Archivists and historians chose to tell stories that go beyond the gilded surface. Stories about servants and refugees, prejudice and endurance, miscalculations and reinventions. That shift points to something important. Inherited wealth and inherited structures do not have to repeat the same patterns forever. They can be reframed, repurposed. Turned from tools of exclusion and display into tools for memory, critique, and understanding. The visitor leaves with a question Ferdinand never had to face in these terms, but we do. What kind of future are we building? One that copies this script, wealth performing legitimacy, labor staying unseen, beauty smoothing over every rough edge, or one that takes places like Waddesdon as lessons instead of blueprints, a future that names what things cost and who pays. That tries to create beauty without exploitation. That treats resources as something to share, not simply to wall off behind stone facades and locked gates. Waddesdon cannot answer that question for us, but it can make the question impossible to ignore. The sun drops below the horizon, the house lights flicker on, electric, still dramatic, still echoing Ferdinand's old victory over literal darkness. Only now we understand what those lights fall on, not just staged elegance, but evidence. The full, messy, morally tangled, deeply human story of what people build when they are afraid, what they sacrifice to keep it, and what remains when they are gone. That is the inheritance Waddesdon offers now, not a fantasy, a mirror. What we see in it depends entirely on how closely we are willing to look. So that is the shocking dark history of Rothschild's Waddesdon Manor, a house built on grief, ambition, and desperate hope, a performance of belonging that never quite succeeded. A fortress that could not protect against the hatred that followed the family across borders and centuries, but also a monument to resilience, to the stubborn refusal to disappear, to the choice, made decades after Ferdinand's death, to turn a private palace into public evidence. To tell the full story, not just the beautiful parts. If you found this deep dive valuable, if you appreciate history that does not look away from the complicated truths, I need your help to keep making these videos. Hit that like button. Subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment telling me which historic house, which controversial family, which hidden story you want me to investigate next. Your support makes this kind of research possible, and together we can keep pulling back the curtain on the real stories behind the world's most famous places. Thank you for watching. And remember, every beautiful facade has a foundation. The question is whether we are brave enough to look at what it is built on.